Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Friday the 27th of September here in London. I'm Caroline Hepker. Coming up today, Chinese stocks make their biggest weekly gains since 2008 as one major investor says that he's buying everything. Israel vows to maintain its bombardment of Hezbollah targets in Lebanon as Benjamin Netanyahu prepares to address the United Nations. Plus, counting the possible cost, Rachel Reeves considers tweaking the UK's tax plans for non-dom foreigners. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. China has cut the amount of cash that banks need in reserve and slashed a key policy rate in a bid to bolster its economy. Authorities say that the reduction in the 7-day reverse repurchase rate to 1.5% will kick in today, but a time frame wasn't given for the percentage point cut to the reserve requirement ratio. Carl Rodder, senior market analyst at Capital.com, says this week's strong stimulus package could change things significantly for the country.
So it looks like they've taken the opportunity now to really do what they did, take out the playbook potentially. We still need to see the details, but this could be huge, and this could be the turning point, not just for China's markets, but certainly for the global economic cycle as well.
Carl Rodder from Capital.com speaking there. The CSI 300 rose more than 4% on the stimulus after Shanghai's trading session resumed. Investor David Tepper said yesterday that he is buying more of, quote, everything China-related following the measures. In an interview with CNBC, the billionaire founder of Appaloosa Management put his big bet down to the shift by Beijing's top leaders this week. Israel's Prime Minister has vowed to continue attacks on Hezbollah targets in Lebanon indefinitely. Speaking before his planned address to the United Nations General Assembly, Benjamin Netanyahu also said that he would engage with efforts by the US and allies to secure a ceasefire. On arrival in New York, Netanyahu told media his forces would not relent before their objectives are realised.
During the flight, I gave approval for the elimination of the head of the UAV unit and other things, and he was eliminated. Our policy is clear. We're continuing to strike Hezbollah with full force, and we will not stop until we reach all of our goals.
Benjamin Netanyahu there speaking via a translator. The US, European countries and Arab powers, including Saudi Arabia and Qatar, all have urged a pause in fighting late on Wednesday after Israel indicated that it was preparing a possible ground invasion of Lebanon. Now to the UK, where the government's October budget is fast approaching, but concerns about proposed changes to rules on overseas wealth could spark a last-minute change. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo has the story.
Scrapping the non-dom regime was one of Keir Starmer's key pledges before his party's landslide election victory in July. But now, Treasury fears that the policy could end up costing revenue or putting a brake on plans. Sources say the Chancellor is considering tweaks to her rollback of the system, which allows foreigners living in the UK to avoid local taxes on overseas earnings for up to 15 years. Two people familiar with the matter told Bloomberg that the changes would be in line with Labour's manifesto promises and announced in the October 30th budget. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
Meanwhile, the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has met Donald Trump for a 2-hour dinner. The British leader had hoped to meet both the presidential candidates face-to-face for the first time, but he couldn't secure a meeting with Kamala Harris. Ahead of the meeting, Donald Trump was asked by the press what he thought of Keir Starmer.
Well, I'm going to see him in about an hour, so I have to be nice, right? But I actually think he's very nice. I think he ran a great race. He did very well. It's very early, but he's popular, and I'll be seeing him, and I'll send you regards.
Trump has said that he wants to peg security guarantees on European nations hitting goals for defence spending. The pair are not natural allies, with Starmer's his current foreign secretary, referring to Trump as, quote, a woman-hating, neo-Nazi sympathising sociopath 6 years ago. New York City Mayor Eric Adams has been indicted on bribery and fraud charges following a federal corruption investigation. He's accused of accepting more than $100,000 in lavish bribes from foreign nationals. Responding to the allegations, Adams said that he will continue to serve as mayor and plans to defend himself against the charges. Now, in a moment, we're going to be talking about the latest when it comes to the Middle East. Benjamin Netanyahu is expected to address the United Nations today. We'll also talk about what's happening in China. But before I get to that, I want to talk about olive oil. A lot of your food basket, of course, and your food bill is all about the weather. You know that, the cost of your vegetables and fruits, and also import prices into the UK. We're more acutely aware of that post-Brexit, aren't we? But we've been doing some analysis of just the extraordinary rise in olive oil prices. Do you know the price of olive oil has tripled in 3 years? That can be traced back to drought and heat wave conditions that we've seen in the Med. But it means that criminals are trying to exploit this, or they are. Data that's been released under a Freedom of Information request shows that the EU has seen this record number of potential olive oil fraud cases. And that one of our reporters has written about all the various ways in which criminal gangs are trying to exploit this and what they're replacing the olive oil with. It sort of makes your hair stand on end, the idea of liquid gold and what it might actually be replaced with. That's, sometimes the term for olive oil. So that's one of the stories that's on the Bloomberg terminal this morning. Slightly lighter from our reporter, Lara Williams. China's benchmark CSI 300 is set for its best week since 2008. It comes as the PBOC has pulled the trigger on easing measures announced by the PBOC Governor Pan Gong-sheng just earlier this week. Joining me now from Hong Kong is our Economy and Government Editor for Greater China, Jenny Marsh. Jenny, very good morning to you. Thank you for being with me. In terms of the size of the impact on China, just take us through what measures have now been enacted and what the impact has been throughout the markets today.
Hi. So there's been a whole treasure trove of measures this week. So we've had rate cuts, which have come into effect today, a reduction of the triple R, so the amount of money banks have to hold in reserve, also coming into effect today. Last night, the Politburo announced what it talked about this month, and they used the September meeting unusually to talk about the economy. They normally only do that in April, July, and December. And in that meeting, there were some really interesting lines. So they pledged for the first time to stop property prices declining and to stabilize the market. That phrase that they used to always sort of roll out, that housing is for living, not speculation, it was gone. We've moved away from that. They talked about ramping up fiscal spending. And then there was a lot of hints in there, a sort of a tilt towards more spending on welfare. They were talking about really making sure that the poorest people are taken care of and listening to the voice of the people. So an awareness that there's a growing dissatisfaction within Chinese society and sort of a willingness to address it. Yes,
that's interesting, isn't it? In terms of what that means, then, when you think about the Chinese consumer and Chinese businesses, does that give them more confidence then, this support? Does it mean an upgrade to the overall economic growth forecast for China?
We aren't seeing a lot of economists upgrading their forecasts right now. It might be that they're taking a little bit of time to digest the measures, but it hasn't sort of shifted the needle for the big banks' official forecasts yet. However, I think anecdotally, people are saying this makes it easier for them to get within that around 5% goal. Around 5%, of course, can mean anything as low as 4.8. So they probably can hit the official target now. But a lot of these measures are sort of being seen as a boon for markets, but not really addressing sort of the fundamental underlying issues that are really troubling the economy. So, it's a quick sort of adrenaline shot, if you like, but it doesn't really do anything to sort of address the structural problems they have around demand and also the property crisis as well. So I think there's still a lot of more meat on the bone to be added yet, but it's definitely a signal from the government that they care about slowing growth. They're not willing to let this grind to a halt while she tries to reorient the economy away from property-driven growth to sort of high-tech manufacturing. You can't basically focus on the new economy and forget the old economy. You have to take care of both.
Yeah. And when you talk about those big structural issues, US officials have actually reacted to China's moves after a number of warnings from the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen that China can't rely, again, as you say, on the old economy, the exports for economic growth.
Well, that's right. So Jay Jambra, the Treasury Undersecretary, has come out saying this was an important step and that domestic demand, needs to go faster, and that Chinese officials now sort of waking up to that. And that is right. I mean, I think the way that we're reading the Politburo statement is the government is saying it knows what needs to be done, whether or not it knows how to do it. It's another thing. It's sort of easy to give markets a boost, but to sort of convince your nation to spend. This is one of the countries that has one of the world's highest household saving rates. It's sort of, embedded within Chinese households to save money, partly because there's a very thin social security net. If you get sick in China, you need money to pay for your medical care. The retirement pension fund, is not enough likely to see you through your old age. Education costs a lot. So there's a lot of things that sort of structurally are holding people back from spending. Declining corporate profits also is making layoffs more prevalent. So there's a lot the government needs to do to make people feel safe enough to spend. And that is a much bigger, longer task. So I think this week's been very positive. The government's showing urgency, but people have to be realistic. The big structural problems they have are going to take years to fix. But, I think as Jay Jambra is saying, they are at least now saying, we get it. We've got to deal with demand.
OK, Jenny, thank you so much for your time this morning. Bloomberg's Greater China Economy and Government Editor, Jenny Marsh. So putting this week's action in China in perspective. Thank you. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu says that airstrikes against Hezbollah targets in Lebanon will continue indefinitely until Israel's northern residents can return to their homes. The proposal for a 3-week ceasefire seems to be on pause. Joining me now, Bloomberg's Paul Wallace, who leads our coverage of the Middle East. Good morning, Paul. So Netanyahu is giving a speech at the UN today. He spoke there only a year ago under very different circumstances. What do you think he's going to say today?
Hi, Caroline. Yeah, you're absolutely right. A year ago, he spoke just before the October the 7th attacks by Hamas. And at that stage, he was very optimistic, talking about the prospects of normalization with Saudi Arabia and what a different world it is now. I think in a lot of ways, he's going to say many of the same things that he did to the US Congress when he spoke in July in a very fiery speech. And in that one, he defended Israel's stance in Gaza, despite all the destruction and the deaths in the Palestinian territory, and said Israel had no choice, that this was a war that it didn't want, obviously, and that it was completely brought upon Israel by Hamas's actions. I think he's going to say more of the same today when he speaks, but also in the context of Hezbollah. Because there's huge concern about the escalations between the Shiite militant group and Israel. They're on the cusp of an all-out war, and there is a high chance that Israel ends up sending ground troops into Lebanon. That's not inevitable, but that's very much a concern of the US, European powers, and others. And I think Iran will also feature heavily in Netanyahu's speech today for months, if not ever since October the 7th. He and his officials have consistently played up the threat of Iran and essentially said it's creating or has already created a ring of fire, as they call it, around Israel, as Tehran seeks to use its proxy groups to essentially destroy the country.
Yeah, so a very difficult moment and highly anticipated speech then in terms of what is being proposed. Just very briefly on the idea of the ceasefire, is that being engaged with at all?
In terms of Hezbollah and Israel, it is. However, I think there's a bit of a sense of deja vu here. The US put out a joint statement with France, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and some others yesterday, proposing a 3-week ceasefire. The very immediate signals from Israel were that they would give this a chance and that they were happy these talks were happening. But very quickly, Israeli officials publicly said they don't want a 3-week ceasefire, that would only allow Hezbollah to regroup, and they're going to continue its airstrikes in Lebanon.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.